Hey guys, it's Boingy and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. Thank you so very much for tuning into today's video. Today we're going to be talking about the unsolved murder of Jacoba Bubbles Schroeder. But before we get into it, you guys already know that I have to make my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anybody that I'm going to be talking about in this video and all the families that were and are affected by this case. This video is purely for educational purposes and all the information was gotten off the internet and simply compiled into one video. With that being said, let's just get right into it. So today's case took place in the 1940s, and although it is a rather popular case in South Africa, not really that popular, but I think it is amongst the popular cases. There's not really that much information about it and the background of the people that we're going to be talking about because it is an old case. And yeah, I just hope that you guys understand that. So Jacoba, also known as Bubbles Schroeder, was born on the 8th of June 1931 to Ernest Schroeder and Louise Schroeder in Lichtenburg, South Africa. When she was 4 years old, her mother had to go away for work, and so Bubbles lived with a cousin of hers in Vereeniging until she was 13, and then she moved back in with her mother in Johannesburg when she turned 13. And then in March of 1948, when Bubbles was just 17 years old, she moved back to Vereeniging to work for a coal agency, but without the knowledge of her family. She actually moved back to Johannesburg 2 months afterwards. And soon after her return, she moved in with a 52-year-old bookmaker named Philip Steyn, whom she met at a dance in Orange Grove. Although Philip really liked having Bubbles around, he soon realized that she was a lot to handle. Bubbles was for the most part a very nice girl, but whenever she drank, she would throw a tantrum and she was just a lot to handle. She would just throw a fit and it was too much for Philip. And because she was too unmanageable, in June of 1949, Philip just asked Bubbles to leave his apartment, and she did. She then moved to a place called Dorchester Mansions, where she lived with a friend called Mrs. Griffin. Mrs. Griffin also confirmed the fact that Bubbles was for the most part a nice girl, but she really became unmanageable and unruly whenever she was drunk. She also said that even though Bubbles didn't have a stable job, she was kind of never short of money. She just always had money, and this was apparently because there were always men who were willing to pay to spend some time with Bubbles, if you know what I mean. She was also referred to as the good times girl. So yeah. On Thursday, the 11th of August 1949, Maurice Bilschick went to visit Dorchester Mansions. He set up a date with Bubbles to meet up the following Saturday, and indeed when the Saturday came, the two did go on this date. At the end of the night, they went back to Morris's house where they spent the night together. On the following Monday morning, Morris boasted and bragged about this little night, adventurous night with Bubbles, to his friend David Polyak, who was 21 years old. I don't know whether David didn't believe him or what, but at lunchtime the two of them did go to meet up with Bubbles at her place in Dorchester Mansions. While they were with Bubbles, they came up with this plan that Bubbles would get a hold of her girlfriend Penny, and then the four of them would get to spend the night together later on that day. But although Bubbles did try to get a hold of Penny, she couldn't reach her, and so they just decided that, oh, you know what, it'll just be the three of us tonight. Once they had set up their plan, Morris and David went back to work. Shortly after they left, Bubbles went to visit Philip Steyn, you must remember him, and she spent the entire afternoon at his apartment. She had a few glasses of brandy and then made her way back to her home at around 6 p.m. When she got there, David and Morris were already waiting for her, and so she just apologized for keeping them waiting and invited them in so that she could just freshen up, put on some makeup, and change her clothes. She changed into a green dress, and at around 7 p.m. they all headed out to David's house, the Polyak mansion, in a posh suburb called Ilovo. She got in the car with David while Morris took his own car and basically drove there by himself. David Polyak's mother was in Durban, so they basically kind of had the whole house to themselves. They got at the house at around 8 p.m. just as David's cousin Hyman Liebman was leaving to go pick up his girlfriend. I'm just going to refer to him as Liebman, I think, because Hyman is a little bit difficult for me. So David told Liebman to invite his girlfriend over so that they can all just have this mini party. But Liebman told him no, because they already had their plans to go to a movie and stuff. So he just rejected the offer and headed out. Once he had left, the three got into the house and had some dinner. Bubbles decided to have some more glasses of brandy. At around 11:15 p.m. Morris decided to leave. It appeared to him that Bubbles and David wanted to be left alone, wanted to have some time alone, so he left. After that, David and Bubbles cleared up the living room and then went upstairs to go listen to some records in David's room. Very shortly after that, Morris called them. At first, he spoke to Bubbles and then he apologized to David for disturbing them, and maybe he felt like he was being a third wheel the entire time and he was disturbing. I don't know why, but he decided to call and apologize very shortly after leaving. At around midnight, Liebman returned. David met him in the hallway and he told him that Bubbles was in his room and that she was extremely drunk and he just wanted to get her home before she passed out in his room. So Liebman went up to David's room to see this for himself, and indeed Bubbles was drunk. So they told her, hey, let's wrap this up, let's get going. But Bubbles didn't want to leave. She instead insisted on having more drinks. Liebman then decided to get her a glass of some weak brandy because he could see that she was very drunk. And then 30 minutes later, at around 12:30 a.m., Bubbles suddenly had a change of heart and insisted on going back home. She explained to them that she was staying with her mother back at Dorchester Mansions and that her mother expected her to be back home by 1 a.m. So I don't know why they didn't take her home immediately, because they did stay at the Polyak Mansions for about an hour. It was only at around 1:30 a.m. that they walked outside and headed towards the cars. David Polyak wanted to take her home, but she got inside Hyman Liebman's car and wouldn't get out. So because of that, Liebman offered to take her home and they drove off, but Bubbles was complaining that she wanted to drive. About 15 to 20 minutes later, Liebman pulled back into the driveway at the Polyak Mansions, alone and annoyed. Now, just to jog your memory a little bit, it took Morris, David and Bubbles an hour to drive from Dorchester Mansions to the Polyak Mansions. But this time it just took Hyman Liebman just about 15 to 20 minutes to drive Bubbles out and then pull back into the driveway. So of course this was too soon, and so David asked Liebman what he did to Bubbles. Where was Bubbles? He said that I guess Bubbles was throwing a tantrum and she wanted to drive and he wouldn't let her drive because she was drunk and his car was new, and so he couldn't take any more of this whole argument or whatever, this whole thing that they were having with Bubbles, and he dropped her off at a bus terminus and told her to follow the bus wires to Oxford Road in order to make her way back to Dorchester Mansions, or to find her way to town. According to him, the last thing Bubbles said to him was, "You will be surprised to read about my corpse in the morning papers." Now that's a very chilling thing. If somebody said something like that to me, I'd probably be haunted by those words forever and ever. Or I'd probably just be like, get back inside and drive them all the way to Dorchester Mansions. I don't know, but that's pretty chilling. If somebody says something like that to you, you should be concerned, I feel. Anyways, Polyak was worried about Bubbles, and even though it was around 2 a.m. at this point, he decided to get in his own car and just drive in that road looking for Bubbles. So he drove along the road looking for Bubbles, and about an hour later he returned back home and said that he couldn't find Bubbles. So both him and Liebman just assumed that Bubbles had probably hiked and made it home safely. They didn't think that anything bad had happened to Bubbles. But that changed when Morris Bilshik called David Poliak at work the following day and told him that he had called at Dorcas Dimensions looking for Bubbles, and Bubbles' mother had informed him that Bubbles didn't return home from her night out. Soon after he heard the news, David Poliak drove to Dorcas Dimensions to go see Bubbles' mother himself, and then him, Morris, and Mrs. Schroeder all drove to Rosebank police station to go report Bubbles missing. David also called the general hospital to check if Bubbles had been admitted there, to no avail. Bubbles wasn't there. Bubbles Schroeder's body was discovered 30 hours after her death at Birdhaven Plantation by Samuel Ngibisa Mobela. The plantation was less than a kilometer from where Liebman had claimed to have dropped Bubbles off. She was found lying on her back on burnt out grass about 30 meters from the road. Her face was turned to the right and her left leg was laid over her right leg. Her left arm was pressed against the side of her body while her right arm was flung out. She had no hat on, no shoes, and her coat was also missing. Although there were some scratch marks and bruises around her neck, there were no footprints around her body and absolutely no signs of a violent struggle. From the way Bubbles was lying, it appeared as if she had been placed there carefully, and this suggested that she was murdered nearby and then carried there and placed carefully. And this was supported by the fact that although both her shoes were missing, there was no soil or grass on her feet. The bodice of her green dress was ripped and one button was missing from it. Her panty was torn on one side, but her petticoat and some other items down there was still intact. The postmortem also revealed that she hadn't been sexually assaulted. There were pieces of a hard clay-like material placed in her mouth, and although this clay-like substance was shoved into her throat, there was none in her lungs, and so this gave the impression that the clay-like substance was put in her mouth after her death. The bruising on her neck also indicated or revealed that she had been strangled from behind, and it was assumed that she had been strangled by a scarf or something similar to a scarf. And it seemed as though she had scratched herself while trying to free herself from the ligature around her neck. She was estimated to have died at around 2 a.m. on the morning of Tuesday, the 16th of August, 1949. The police launched a large-scale search in the area around Birdhaven Plantation where Bubbles' body was found, but they found absolutely nothing. But even though they didn't find anything, about 2 months later, on the 13th of October, the police arrested Hyman Liebman and David Poliak in connection to the murder of Bubbles Schroeder. They appeared in court the following day, but they were denied bail. However, they were granted bail sometime later on. Their trial began a few days after they had been granted bail at the Johannesburg Magistrates Court. The evidence against them was mainly circumstantial, and it was based on just theories. It was based on the fact that David and Hyman were the last person to see Bubbles alive, and they were with her late that night. The evidence was literally entirely circumstantial, and so because there was no direct evidence linking them to the murder, they were acquitted. Like I said earlier on, this case remains unsolved to this day, but there have been three mainly believed theories that have been, created over the years, but the question still remains: who killed Bubbles Schroeder? The first theory was that Hyman Liebman had killed Bubbles. It was assumed that he wanted to have sex with her, and when Bubbles did not want to, he ended up strangling her with a scarf in his car. And then he carried Bubbles away from the road and placed her carefully. But there was no evidence supporting this theory or this claim apart from the fact that Bubbles was in his car. He did not deny the fact that Bubbles was in his car, but we cannot just say, oh, Bubbles was in his car, therefore he killed her. That's not how it works. The second theory was that Bubbles was robbed and killed by a passing black person. This theory was supported by the fact that there was lime stuffed inside Bubbles' mouth. Apparently, black people back then used to stuff lime into the mouths of dead people, maybe to show respect or something. I don't know, but when they died in a horrific way, they had lime stuffed in their mouth. This theory was weak and a lot of people didn't believe it, and this was because it just didn't seem like Bubbles was robbed, and also her body was placed so neatly and so carefully that it just didn't seem like someone would rob you and then place your body like that, lay down your body like that. It just, the combos were not communicating, basically. The third and mainly believed theory was advanced by Benjamin Bennett, who was a crime writer for the Argus at the time of this crime. He suggested that Bubbles probably hitchhiked and was picked up by a passing motorist. There were probably two men in the car, and the passenger moved to the back seat so that Bubbles could sit in the front, and they started making some sexual advances, and maybe Bubbles rejected them and they assaulted her or put in a fight, and the person in the back was in the perfect position to strangle her using a scarf from the back. They then carried her to a nearby plantation and dumped her body, and the lime was stuffed in her mouth simply to throw the police off track and make them believe that she was probably killed by a black person, as the second theory suggested. These are all just theories. Again, I repeat, this case remains unsolved to this day. I don't know which theory is more plausible to you, but I feel like the third one could be the most plausible. It's the one that makes the most sense, honestly. But let me know which one you think it could be what happened to Bubbles Schroeder, or if you could come up with your own theory, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, and also if you enjoyed it, you'll probably enjoy this one as well. Or you can subscribe to my channel because there's plenty more where this came from. Thank you once again for tuning into today's video. I'll see you in my next one. Bye.